What's up, everybody? Benji Bruce here with SpeakingLifestyle.com. And in this video, we're going to talk about just great podcast presenters. So what makes a difference between a great podcast presenter and everybody else? So the better you are at presenting on your podcast or just a video in general, the more powerful you present, the more you're going to be able to keep people's attention and grow that audience. So that's why you obviously want to become great at what you do. You want to be a powerful presenter. So what makes the difference though? So what I've seen, so I look at these guys or listen to these people like Joe Rogan, Lex Fridman, the Caller Daddy. I don't really listen to that one, but I mean, I've listened to episodes of it just to kind of see like, hey, what are they doing? Like, what are they doing that's different than everybody else? And so one of the first things that you'll notice is every single one of them, they all have great topics. They all have great topics that their audience is interested in. So someone like Lex Fridman, Joe Rogan, these guys, they do what's called newsjacking, to where they look at what's being talked about in the news, what's trending, and they put their own twist to it. They talk about their opinions on it. So whatever people are talking about nowadays, that's what they talk about. They just insert their own opinion. It's basically like the news, but they're not. The news is insanely negative. These guys are putting in their own opinions. They're actually having a real conversation about it. Whereas, the news are like, the whole world's coming to an end. So these guys, they take what people are naturally interested in and they talk about that thing. So they're talking about great topics to begin with. Now, obviously, talking about a great topic is subjective. So like the Crime Junkie podcast, it's a podcast I would never listen to, but it's one of the top podcasts because they're talking about like these crimes and the crime stuff where it's just interesting in terms of, their audience finds it interesting in terms of how they do these crime scenes and how they're talking about all this crime stuff. But I personally wouldn't follow it just because I'm not interested in that thing. So you notice that every single one of these podcasters, they all understand their audience really well. They understand what people want to listen to, the topics, and that's where everything starts. Next thing that all these great podcasters do is they're very immersive with how they talk, with what it is they're talking about. So either they talk about interesting things or they make the thing that they're talking about interesting. So it's either or. So like, what is it? The film Crime Junkie podcast or something like that. But basically it's this crime podcast. It's really interesting in terms of how they do it because they got all these sound effects, the music's going, so they create the mood of like this suspense mood, like you're watching American Psycho, like, oh man. And so they have all this, they have the sound effects in it. And so it creates this immersive type of feeling with the podcast to where when they're talking, they don't just have a monotone voice. It's not just, all right, everybody, so we're going to talk about your mindset and how you're going to build these habits. It's this, they use their voice to get a feeling across, to make you feel like you've entered the matrix. So that's really what they're doing. Like the crime ones, they're really good at it because I guess they have to be, really. It'd be pretty boring. Think about listening to an audiobook, a fiction audiobook, and the narrator, they're just sitting there like, and Harry Potter said, Expelliarmus. Ron said, oh no, get out of my way. Like, it would just sound boring. Whereas if he was like, and Harry Potter yells out, Expelliarmus! And Ron says, get away from me! So like, it just seems better, a million times better when they're immersive in that way. You'll notice that a lot of them, if they're not talking about interesting things like Joe Rogan, Lex Fridman, to where the thing is naturally interesting, then they have to make the thing interesting in and of itself. So that's why, like, you see that they're different tones in their voice, sound effects, and all sort of stuff. So it's really immersive. Another thing that the great podcasters do is, if they're doing interviews, and this is just for the ones that are doing interviews, the great ones don't interrupt people. I don't want to name names, Gary Vaynerchuk, but a couple podcasters, they will interrupt their guests, and it is annoying as hell. The best I've ever seen at this, the best interviewer I've seen in a long time was this lady, Natalie Workman, where she interviewed Grant Cardone. And if you listen to the interview, as she's talking to him, she's asking him a question, she's letting him answer, and she also leaves like a little dead space in there. So as he answers, and you would think, okay, now I'm gonna ask him another question. She doesn't. She just waits. And then naturally, Grant Cardone, he opens up even more. So she actually listens to him, and then when he says something that that she's like naturally thinking about, she thinks, well, let me make him explain this a little bit more. So she's actually playing off of him. It's not like when you see podcasters or hear podcasters and they're doing interviews, it sounds too scripted to where it's like, all right, question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. And it sounds weird. It doesn't sound like a conversation that they're having. But if you listen to her, I don't know if it was a podcast, whatever, but it was a video that I saw. If you listen to her with Grant Cardone, Natalie Workman, then you'll see in terms of how she's having a conversation with them. So if you are actually doing interviews, don't interrupt mofos. It is annoying as hell. Don't interrupt people. You'll also notice that the people, they're really good at building rapport. So maybe they'll ask questions that the interviewer has never really been asked before. Because, I mean, if you've been interviewed, you'll notice that people ask the same questions. Hey, how did you get your start? Like, what's one piece of advice that you would give all these entrepreneurs? It's very similar questions that people tend to ask. So the person who's getting interviewed, they go into like this script of like, oh, okay, yeah, everybody's asking me that. So it's like they answer it in the same way. But if people ask them random questions, what if you could be an animal, what animal would it be? And so like if they ask them this random question, then you'll see them like open up in some sort of way. So great interviewers, they do their research on the person. So the great interviewers, the better the research, the better the interviewer actually is, the better the interview is. Now there's this guy, he is actually known in the I guess the paparazzi world, the celebrity world, in terms of interviewing people, and I can't remember his name. I feel like it starts with an N, Nardwar or something like that. But he is known to interview people in a scary way. When I say scary, what I mean is that he studies their past so well, where when he interviews this celebrity, Jay-Z, whoever he's interviewing, he brings up stuff that nobody knew about. He's like, yeah, I mean, I heard, back when you were 2 years old and you used to do this thing and this, and your first label company was this. And the celebrities look at him like, how the did you know that? What? Like, and that's literally everyone's reactions. They're like, dude, what the are you with Secret Service or something? That's literally the celebrities' reactions. I think that is his name, Nardwar. And the reason he's such a great interviewer is because he looks into their past. He actually studies the person that he's interviewing. He looks them up and then he asks questions based on that. So if you want to truly like build rapport with people and truly you're going to do these interviews on your podcast, don't do what everybody else is doing. Don't ask all these basic questions of, hey, so tell us your number one advice that you give to all these entrepreneurs. Tell us a little bit about your past, because what's going to happen is that interviewer or the guest, they're essentially just going to be in their normal mode. Well, number one advice I give is be persistent, everybody. Be persistent. And so it's just going to be basic answers that they're going to give. So make sure, 1, you don't interrupt people, and 2, do your research, like really, really do your research on the person. And then 3, you got to build that rapport by asking them questions that they've never really been asked before. What about solo podcasters, right? So if this is just you, well, how do you actually make yourself a better solo podcaster? Now, you'll see that the best solo podcasters, what they do is it feels like they're just talking to you. Like it's just you that they're talking to. It feels very personal, and it feels like you're a voyeur. So it's kind of like you get to see inside of their mind to where they're talking, and you're like, oh, interesting, because they're talking. It's like they're talking about secrets. They're talking about things that they normally wouldn't talk about to everyone else, and you get to listen in on that thing. And so naturally, as a solo podcaster, when they do it that way, you're thinking, oh, ooh, interesting. I've never really heard it. I've never heard someone say it like that. Oh, and so a perfect example of this, like in terms of talking behind closed doors, but talking to the public, is the podcast Call Her Daddy. Now, when I heard about this podcast, I was like, the name in and of itself, I'm like, what? So I went to YouTube. I've never actually listened to podcasts, just audio versions. I went to YouTube, typed in their podcast, I clicked on it. I was like, damn, they're talking about dildos and all sorts of stuff, right? And that is why she has one of the top podcasts right now, just because she's talking about things that are talked about in private. She's talking about it in public. And because of that, people feel like people feel like she's talking just to them. So it's kind of like, oh, snap, what? Oh, girl, oh, snap. And so it gets that feeling to where it's like, oh, she's just talking to me. So what you want to do is you want to think in terms of how do you talk when you're around friends? So it's like, when you're around, let's say your boss or whatever, you're around in the public, you talk a certain way. But when you're around close friends, you say things that you don't normally say just out loud, that you don't normally say to everybody else. How do you talk like that? If you talk the way you do in private, but if you talk like that in public on your podcast, you're going to naturally just be more interesting because of the way you're talking. So that's what solo podcasters tend to do, just to actually keep your attention. Now, the final thing I want to mention in terms of what makes a great podcaster is you'll notice every single one of them has their own style. Every single one of them. So just the way they talk, the way they do things, they have their own style, their own pizzazz, their own it factor. So of course they have things like good audio and all that sort of stuff, but they all have their own style. Like, the Call Her Daddy one, X-rated, Lex Friedman, it's like an intellectual type of style. So they all have their own style. I don't mean like in terms of look, like the way studios look. Of course they all look different, but I mean their own style, their own way of presenting, the X-rated, the intellectual, the dumbed down versions. So it's like they all have their own style. So you're going to naturally have to find your own style when you're creating your podcast. Well, if you just want to become a better podcast presenter. So those are the main things that I see with great podcast presenters compared to everybody else. If you master this skill of becoming a great podcast presenter, or just a great presenter in general, you will naturally get more people to follow you, like you, and all that sort of stuff. Speaking of following and liking, you know what you got to do. You know what you got to do on this video. Come on, man. Come on. I will see you guys later.